Hey everyone, and welcome back to Dev in the Details, a podcast where I try to break down the world of AI, agents, LLMs, and what they all really mean for businesses and the people building them. Over the past few years, we've watched LLMs evolve from academic experiments into enterprise helpers, and now, into AI employees as well. The most common trend that we see as we speak with organizations and enterprises is people going beyond just better search with LLMs and starting to stitch them together with tools into agentic workflows. But with the power of agents seems to come a lot of complexity, risk, and new questions. Today, I wanted to try and uncover the most pressing ones and clarify things, as well as bring on my favorite guest, who is Travis. Travis was my co-founder and CTO at Predibase. He was the technical brain behind most of what we were building. And prior to his experience at Predibase, he was a tech lead manager on the deep learning infrastructure team at Uber. Travis has been the co-author for a number of open source ABEL framework projects, including Horovod for distributed deep learning training infrastructure, and Lorax for efficient LLM serving and inference. Hello, Travis. Would you want to say hello to everybody?
Yeah, hi Dev. Hi everyone. Really excited to be here. Yeah, it's been really crazy being on this journey for all these years now, going from working on machine learning and AI at Uber back when it was just like, how do we get people to buy more stuff on Uber Eats, to seeing like where we are today with agents and everything we built at Predibase along the way. So excited to be here to talk about it.
Awesome. Well, I'm excited to talk a little bit today around how LLM adoption is shifting, what enterprises are actually struggling with. And I thought I'd focus today's conversation, a larger part around two themes. The first is, what we've been learning as we've been speaking more towards the Global 2000 enterprise persona. And the second is this market shift we're seeing around agents. So let me dive into that. Travis, you and I have just spent the last few months doing market research. I think we've spoken with over 100 different enterprise customers in the last 8 weeks, and talking really to understand what their pains are. Tell me a little bit from your perspective after these conversations, how you think things are actually changing with AI and AI agent adoption.
Yeah, well, it's interesting because I feel like when this whole Gen AI revolution kicked off with ChatGPT, that the core use case that I always thought about was like, oh, this is going to be such a huge enabler of making enterprises more productive, like automating a lot of busy work and things like that. And I think what we've seen is the past maybe year or so, year and a half, that this has actually started happening for real in very specific domains, like specifically these very verticalized applications. Like I think in the legal space with Harvey is like a really great success story. You're also seeing like coding being a huge winner on the automation front with tools like Cursor that are just making like engineers so much more productive. But I think that like the broader problem of how do we make enterprises more efficient has yet to be completely solved because so much of the work that goes on in the kind of back rooms of these businesses is bespoke and very custom. And so that's where I think a lot of these custom agentic applications are where enterprises are trying to invest in order to win the future. But they've run into some challenges along the way. And now feels like the moment where they're finally starting to overcome a lot of those and asking the questions on what's next. Okay, now that we got an agent working that's like doing some tasks that a human used to have to do, how do we scale this to a future state where you have, hundreds or even thousands of these agents in an enterprise? And it's a really interesting time to be working in this space and thinking about like how businesses are trying to tackle this problem.
Yeah, I agree on the really interesting time because it feels like we're on the cusp of it. Um, I think 2 years ago, Travis, when we were working on Predibase, generative AI hit the stage, and my first view is everyone was building better search to some extent. And as you said, the opportunity was really on kind of this workflow automation, productivity gains. It feels like everybody now is starting to build agents. What are the challenges that you're hearing surface up once they go beyond that very first demo or that quick hackathon project?
Yeah, well, I think that like in any piece of software, particularly as it gets more complicated, you have this kind of like 80-20 problem where it's like getting the first 80% of it to work more or less correctly. kind of tricks you into thinking that that last 20% is going to take a, constant amount of time proportionally. Um, but in reality, like there's this huge long tail of problems that need to be solved in order to actually get something in production. I mean, I think we saw this very clearly with like self-driving cars, a few years back, where it's like, oh, we can get them to drive pretty successfully on the road, but can we get them to like solve all these complex scenarios that, are ultimately like what we entrust humans to do to like avoid getting into fatal accidents? Finally, we're starting to get to that point with like Waymo and Tesla, but I think now we're starting to think about these same problems with generative AI and these agentic systems. Is okay, we can get it to, maybe solve like some very basic customer support issues if you're building like a frontline customer support automation system. But there's obviously a huge long tail of what humans might try to do with an AI system or an agentic system. How do you cover that whole space? And I think it's particularly problematic for agents because of the fact that we are using this natural language interface, and like the combinatorial space of like what you can input into a natural language prompt is like infinite. So I think to kind of make this a little bit more concrete, like there's obviously this problem on quality that we're seeing today where people don't know how good their agents actually are and how well they're going to perform like in the wild, both in terms of like just the kind of, good or bad, like is the response good, is it not? But then there's also all this these sets of like more um, pathological, I guess you could call it, concerns as well. Like could the agent be exploited in some way to do something harmful? Could it be tricked into, giving my customers like, massive amounts of money in reimbursements, or like saying good things about my competitors or something? So there's all these kinds of questions on safety, control, quality that kind of all play into each other. And then there's also this whole element of like governance, security, and understanding as well, where it's like, uh, that starts with like basic observability. Like, do I even know what agents are deployed in my organizations? Do I know what data it has access to? Do I know what identity it's assuming, and therefore what applications it can use? What the blast radius is, what the access is, and then do I have some assurances that like I can recover if something goes wrong? Like, do I have a plan in place for being able to prevent that? And I think all of this rolls up into this umbrella of like trust. Like, can I trust my agents to do what they're supposed to do and to not go off script and do something harmful or do something that ultimately leads to, like me being worse off than if I had never used the agent in the first place?
So first of all, I'm glad you said 80-20 and not 80-90. And then secondly, what I'm curious about, Travis, is you kind of you started to talk through like all these different issues which related to, it's the agent accessing data. What might it say? What if it makes the wrong refund request? Can I trust it? Do I have it? How is anyone going to get anything done? And what I mean by that is like if I were an enterprise organization and I was like, here's the 100 things that could go wrong and I need to have answers for them, I haven't seen that much in terms of tooling or product that makes that life easier. And instead, I've been sitting on some of our AI governance committee meetings as well, and I'm realizing how much of a challenge it is. What do you think are sort of the required capabilities that are going to have to exist in the market to actually enable an enterprise to get something done? Because that is a long laundry list of like concerns and risks.
For sure. And I think that it ultimately, like you kind of asked the question, like, what are they going to do? Like, I think today the plan is they're effectively going to move a lot slower than they would like, right? Because the reality is that if they don't have these assurances, they're not going to deploy something that's half baked. And so the reality is they're going to move slower. They're going to be more hesitant to actually adopt the technology. But that comes with its own set of risks, right? It's like, okay, you can build like extreme confidence in one particular narrow solution, but if your competitor is maybe a little bit more risk forward, then they might be able to out execute you and like, win the market, because you're too busy being defensive, right? So the reality is that like the way companies I think are typically approaching it by being hesitant to adopt the technology might prevent like the downside, but also will result in them missing out on the upside. So I think there's a very real concern here that needs to be solved. in terms of what tooling exists that can solve this problem, I don't think that there's a perfect answer today, but I think that the capabilities of what needs to exist are somewhat understood. It's like first you need to be able to observe what is being done in your organization. So like what agents, and this is of course thinking about like, there's obviously different levels you could think about this, like the developer perspective, all the way up to like the stakeholder perspective. And so if you're thinking more of that stakeholder like CIO, CISO, AI governance, head, right? What do they need to do? Then it starts with observability, like understanding how AI is being used and deployed in your organization, both for internal and external, like kind of end user facing applications. So having that complete visibility into what agents exist, what systems are they interacting with, what do they have access to? So like what could they do, as well as auditing what they are doing, and then having some basic policies in place that you can define to say this is what I consider to be the approved space for these agents to operate in, and then measuring what they're actually doing against what you've defined as the policy. So saying, I don't want my agents to take destructive actions that might mutate data in my production environment. I only want them to read data and then be able to say, are any systems violating that policy? Like that's like a table stakes thing that must exist. And then once you have that observability, I think you need to be able to validate that your agents are actually fully adhering to not just the policies that you've defined, but are also adhering to whatever safety criteria you have around security. So not leaking, sensitive internal data, not leaking credentials, not saying anything harmful. So guardrails, and then quality, like making sure that they meet the level of correctness and accuracy that you need in order to feel comfortable deploying into production. And then finally, I think one thing that often gets overlooked is, okay, so you put all this like kind of preventative stuff in place, like to make sure that everything is, working well, is not going to go wrong. But then like, what if something does go wrong, because you can't plan for everything? You need to have some kind of fail safe to resolve issues after they've happened. So whether that's undoing the mistakes that were made by an agentic system, or putting in place like patches, remediations, correcting policies that need to be corrected after mistakes are made to prevent them from happening again in the future.
I was at, and some of our team also was at the AI conference in the Bay Area recently, and it felt like every third talk was about governance and observability. But honestly, a lot of it did feel hand wavy. I think one of the reasons is because people didn't structure it in these like pillars like you just did in terms of here are the sets of required capabilities you need. So I liked that framework a lot around observability, governance, and policy enforcement. Remediation is like key capabilities. I want to double click into one that's a little bit more tactical. I think what you described are really good pillars to be able to set up around. One of the new frameworks that feels like it's supposed to hold a lot of promise for agents is around MCP. And so Anthropic came out with a protocol as a way that I kind of think about to give agents API access to all applications and systems you might want to use. But I hear a lot around security challenges around MCP. We've both spoken to a number of Fortune 500s that said, would love to adopt it tomorrow, but I can't. I can't get it approved. What are the kinds of security challenges that you're hearing the most around model context protocol for those that might not be as familiar? Just start off by telling me a little bit about like what you're seeing as the security challenges that it poses, and then also what you think is the promise of MCP if those were solved.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, I think MCP is interesting because people have been building agents for a while now, but MCP really came on the scene earlier this year, like maybe January, February is when people started talking about it seriously. And so a lot of people tried solving this problem independently, which is fundamentally like, how do I have a standardized way to give an agent an understanding of what APIs it has access to, and then let it choose the right API to call for a particular task that's trying to solve. So it's like if I'm trying to get it to solve a customer support ticket, it needs to have the ability to interact with my, customer support management system and be able to read from it, write from it, et cetera. And so MCP developed by Anthropic is, one of the ways that people have tried to solve this problem. Is gaining a lot of traction in the industry. But it's a very new protocol. And so there's still a lot of questions people have around what the enterprise grade solution for this looks like. Today I'd say most usage of MCP ends up being running a local MCP server. So kind of to give a little context for those who might not know is like, you have your LLM, which is maybe OpenAI or Anthropic. It's running somewhere in the cloud on an endpoint. And then you have your agent, which could be like a custom agent that you build, or could even be defined as like Claude Desktop or something, right? It's like a local system that you can plug into tools and have it be able to figure out what tool to use dynamically based on the context of the query. And so what people are often doing today is they're saying, well, I want my Claude desktop application to be able to hook into my Jira issue tracking system. So I'm going to run a Jira MCP server locally and then let it, ping that. And then to stand up the server, I'm going to give it an API token for my user in Jira. And that's the way that's going to authenticate. And I think that this makes sense if everything you're doing is on your local laptop. And it's like, who really cares if that credential like is perfectly scoped or not to what the agent needs to do. It's like effectively it's just accelerating the work that you would have done manually using your API token anyway. It's like we could always have done this by writing Python scripts that abuse your access token to do one thing or another, right? But where this starts to get complicated for enterprises is if I'm not just talking about like building a little local, like on my laptop kind of application, but if I'm trying to build an agent as like a backend service that can automate some person's job or can be used on behalf of multiple people in my organization or is going to be is going to be interacting with like the actual customers of my organization, like then all of a sudden, local laptop server with my API credential is probably not the most secure way to think about managing this system, right? So a few things that come up is one, identity and access. So like, can we standardize the ways that these sorts of what we call clients or in the MCP world, so like an agent application, authenticate and interact with these MCP servers through a protocol like OAuth.
Mm-hmm.
And OAuth is starting to become part of the official MCP standard. So there is like some standardized ways that people do OAuth authentication for remote MCP servers. That's its own can of worms though, because we still got to get all MCP servers to become remote, and some will never be remote, like something that an MCP server that interacts with like your local hard drive or something like that. But that's one way that people are trying to solve that problem. But OAuth in and of itself is not going to completely remove the security problems with MCP. Like one other challenge that exists is, I have an OAuth token that's granted certain scopes for what this identity can do.
Mm-hmm.
But how do I know that those scopes are at the right granularity? One, for the MCP server, because they're not one to one. It's like the MCP server has tools, the API token has scopes. These things, ultimately every tool will invoke the credential with some set of scopes, but it's not like perfectly mapped. So you can't easily say this OAuth token has permission to call these tools, but not these tools. But also, oftentimes these flows are over permissioned, right? So you end up in situations where your agent is given access to do whatever the user can do, but that's probably not what you want. You probably want the agent to do the intersection between what the end user can do and what the agent is intended to do, and have an authentication system that can figure out the right set of scopes for this combination of identities, because the agent has an identity and the end user has an identity as well.
Mm-hmm.
And this gets even more complicated if you have a multi-agent system where one agent then needs to call another agent that calls another agent. And this problem that then becomes called like delegated identity. It's like, how do you properly chain the custody of that token and those scopes of permissions across all these different agents? So that's a big problem. There are also other problems with MCP servers that are a little bit more vanilla by kind of security standards. So there's this whole world of supply chain concerns around what if someone puts malicious code into an MCP server. Most of those I don't think are unique to MCP as a protocol, but they do still exist.
Hmm.
Um, but you also have like some problems that I think are a little bit more unique to MCP around identity and access, which is around kind of safety and supply chain, which is around which MCP servers are being used by your agents. So oftentimes organizations want to have control over, well, I don't actually want like my organization's agents to be interacting with Workday because there's sensitive information about salaries and personnel there and PII.
Yeah.
And how do you put an enforcement layer on that? It's like it's one thing to say, okay, my user within my organization got an API token to call the Workday APIs. Maybe I'm okay with that, but I'm not okay with someone sticking that in front of a web server and then letting everyone in the organization call this service as an agent to be able to interact with Workday using the permissions that that user has. So even knowing that this is happening is a blind spot for organizations today. Like they don't know what MCP servers are out there. They don't know how to enforce an allow list of, kind of blessed MCP servers and make sure that only those MCP servers are being used and not some random MCP server that I got off GitHub that might have malicious code in it.
Right.
Just no one has any way of dealing with this today. So broadly, I'd say those are the two biggest challenges that I see on the MCP security side.
And I think it's a really interesting challenge because I kind of see MCP as doing maybe the first half of a challenge that I think is real, which is um, in order for agents to be effective at automating workflows, they need to get access to enterprise infrastructure, tooling, and applications. But those tooling and applications aren't built for AI agents. Sort of similar to like how, in order to be able to get value out of the cloud, you needed to be able to move things over into the cloud. Your on-prem data workloads, at least now, need to become cloud data workloads. That took organizations forever. I think we're hoping with agents it's going to be a lot faster, and MCP is a way to bridge existing applications to an interface that agents can understand. But that security and IAM layer has really not been figured out around MCP in a large way. Are there any approaches that you think are going to become, like, if you had to predict, in terms of approaches you think will become more standard for MCP? If we said today it was a lot of hard coded credentials, do you think like remote MCP service plus OAuth, or do you think something else is going to become more standardized as we look to fix MCP servers? Will these MCP whitelist companies? I see a lot of startups that essentially just run whitelist of trusted MCP servers. Would you bet on those? Where are you going to put your upcoming angel investment and allocations?
Good question. Yeah.
As a joke.
Um, so I definitely do think that the idea of having MCP registries, like kind of Artifactory for MCP, I do think that's going to be a real thing that organizations will adopt. And I kind of would break into two different categories. Like one is the infrastructure piece of like managed MCP servers. I'm kind of bearish on that as a category because I think that most applications like Workday, Salesforce, et cetera, they're just going to have their own remote MCP servers that they'll run, and like people just interact with them the same way they interact with any other API. Obviously, for internal applications, like if I have some internal microservice, I'll need to write my own MCP server for that. But I think that the tooling will get sufficiently easy for this that people will just, like individual teams who own the microservice will just also own the MCP server, and that'll be like a pretty standard thing to do. But the bigger question then becomes the actual service discovery bit, like being able to create like a directory of like these are the MCP servers that exist in my organization that I can use, and what permissions I need to have to use them for different scenarios. I do think there's a real problem there that like needs to be solved, and will eventually be solved as a combination of things happen, like namely the MCP standard becomes more mature around its security features, but then also as like adoption grows as well. So I do think that's a very real problem that we're going to see more of. And then I think there was another part of your question. I forget what it was.
I think it was like, yeah, what's the standardized protocol going to become for managing identity with like, remote
Oh,
MCP?
for identity. Yeah, yeah. So on the identity piece, so kind of separate from like the MCP governance, I do think the way that we're solving identity today is, not the way we're going to be solving identity for agents in the terminal state. I see a lot of companies exploring this idea of creating specific identities for agents. And I think that one kind of maybe position that I've seen taken before is like, well, why don't you just create a service account for your agent? And then it's like, it's kind of like an identity, but but the problem is that you have this dynamic set of permissioning that you need to do for the agents. So we talked about like the delegated identity. It's like the agent is being asked to do something by a human, and the agent has its own, ideally has its own scope of permissions. The human has its own scope of permissions. How do I kind of intersect those things? I think you need to have like some canonical definition of an agent identity to solve that problem fully. And so I think IDPs, the kind of identity providers, are eventually going to figure this out. And there's going to be some standardized way to say, okay, this is an agent that's wanting a kind of just in time token to do something. Here's what the agent's supposed to do. Here's what the user has permission to do. And then here's what maybe the agent that the agent is calling has permission to do. Like figure out what token should be authorized to take action, grant it, make sure it's only used within the purview of that particular workflow, and then get rid of it. So just in time access that's exactly scoped to the task that's being done in the moment.
That I feel like is going to be necessary, honestly, for broader MCP adoption. And it's really interesting to see kind of the workarounds people have come up with in the meantime. Well, this has been a good technical discussion, I think, especially in terms of some of the current frictions we see around adoption towards tooling like MCP and the agent layer. I want to just end with maybe a question that bubbles it up maybe at 30,000 feet, which is you use the word trust, and I like that word in terms of what I think is the missing formula for AI. I see a lot of these Gartner and MIT studies talking about enterprise AI adoption, and they indicate that, the enterprise AI adoption is still slow or it's still coming. And on the flip side, if you open up X or Twitter, everything is about Gen AI startups and how people are scaling out to 100 million revenue in like unforeseen time. And I think one of the biggest deltas between like these two narratives is like enterprises actually have a stronger requirement around trust when it comes towards AI before they're going to be able to get the same level of adoption. So I want to understand, your view, if you were to forecast out 12, 24, 36 months out, anytime over the next 1, 2, 3 years, what do you think the future of trustworthy or resilient AI is going to look like? What's going to be different, 2 years out when we think about trusted AI than today?
So I definitely feel like every organization is going to need to have something like a workday for agents that gives you a complete understanding of like, here are all the agents that exist in my organization. And then similar to how you have like performance reviews for humans, like some kind of assessment that says, this is how well the agent is doing. This is like, any mistakes it's made, any like security vulnerabilities it has, any governance policy violations that it has. And then I think critically event in the eventual state is also connecting its actions and its performance back to business outcomes and metrics, like how much productivity am I actually gaining by deploying this agent versus having a human do that equivalent work. So being able to have that like, high level snapshot or like be able to dig into these agents and understand what they're doing well, what they're not, where the mistakes are. I think that's where this needs to go ultimately. Um, and I think obviously we're still a ways away from that end state, but like that's I think where I would ideally want to see it if we look out like 2 3 years from now.
I really like that as a concise way to summarize the vision, like a workday like system for agents. Essentially, a way to manage agents as if they are really your next generation automation employees. So, Travis, thanks so much for joining. I think this conversation here, I really enjoyed it, especially as we thought a little bit about what are we seeing from enterprises, what's blocking adoption, what's enabling adoption, and then what do we think is going to be the future around agents. I think for me, one of the core takeaways is that for enterprise AI to really take off, we need to be able to use and build a trusted layer, as you've mentioned, that gives people resilience and the ability to actually have faith in the system that they've built is going to be something that improves their lives, not degrades it. And interestingly, a lot of the uptake and adoption we've seen in, I think, consumer and the mid-market and even the early stage startup space for the AI, I think has had less of this scrutiny. But when we go into G2K and larger enterprises, this is going to be one of the number one things people are thinking about. So I'm glad we had a chance to talk through agents, and it's brought up a lot of conversations around governance. I'm excited to keep talking about this topic as well. But let me just go ahead and close us out here. And I'll just say, if you're following AI, if you're a builder, a founder, an enterprise leader, anyone who's wrestling with these challenges, I think we'd love to hear your questions. Your questions are what shapes our future in a lot of ways. So please keep them coming. And with that, I'll say until next time, I hope you enjoyed this edition of Dev in the Details. See you.